One of my favorite things, I have many favorite things, I'm a man of many hobbies and passions, dabble in a little bit of everything, horrible at all of them probably. But one of my favorite things that I've liked since I was a very young child, like many people probably have liked since they were very young, is comic book superheroes. Now, I never took too much time reading the actual comic books, but I watched a lot of the cartoons, and I began to appreciate what Superman and Spider-Man and all these heroes represent. They kind of represent the good in all of us. They represent the things that are the best traits in us. And you know, the Bible also has a few superheroes in it as well. Maybe not in the same sense, but it does have superheroes. And we're going to begin this month or this week with a month-long study of superheroes of the Bible. We're going to start with Moses, and we're going to work our way through a couple others. I'm not going to name all those because I'm not sure which ones I'm going with yet. Superman was quoted as saying, "There is right and wrong in the universe, and the distinction is not hard to make." And I think superheroes and supervillains help us see some of that distinction. Each week we're going to do this in true comic book fashion as we go through this month. For each hero, we're going to look, number one, at their origin story, where they came from, how they got started, their superpower, whatever that may be, each week it'll be a different one, and then finally their kryptonite, or weakness. This week, as I've said, is Moses. Now we all know a little bit, or maybe even a whole lot, about Moses. Even our children probably know a whole lot about Moses. And we know there's a lot to be said about him in both the Old and the New Testaments as well. And we'll be bouncing between those two as we study this Moses, Super Moses, if you will. Number one, I want to look at his origin story. We'll notice two things in regard to this origin story. We'll notice God's timing in place as well as God's preparation of Moses for what was to come. Now, we know the background. The Israelites are in Egypt. The Pharaoh that knew Joseph has passed away, and the people of Egypt began to fear and not disdain, rather, the people of Israel. They set taskmasters over them, made them slaves, and worked them very hard. They also feared that they would become so many that they could defeat the Egyptians or join others with them against them in battle. So they began commanding that all the male children be killed. Now some of the midwives helped prevent some of that, but then finally they said, if a male child of the Israelites is born, just chunk him in the river. But there was one family, at least, I'm sure there were more, who chose another option, thus beginning the providence of God's life, and thus beginning Moses' origin story. Turn with me, if you will, to Exodus chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the river, while her young woman walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away, nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. Immediately, at the birth of Moses, we begin to see that providence taking place. Pharaoh's daughter just happened to come along and find Moses? No. God had predestined all of this to happen long before it did. So we see that Moses, when he gets to be a little bit older, goes to Pharaoh's daughter's house, Pharaoh's house, and he's raised there as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And 40 years pass in this time. The background begins to be set. He's learning in the ways of the Egyptians. He's studying. He's growing in knowledge and hopefully wisdom. But then after 40 years, he starts to think about his people. He probably already had been. He starts to think about being their deliverer. But Moses took the timing into his own hands rather than leaving it up to God's timing. And he slays an Egyptian in anger. We'll talk more about that toward the end of the sermon. Exodus 2:11 through 15. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. I believe they would call that somewhat premeditated, since he looked around. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, why do you strike your companion? He answered, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely this thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And you go on to read that he met his father-in-law Jethro and his daughters, and ends up marrying Zipporah and stays there another 40 years. Now Moses thought it was time to help his people. He thought it was time to jump in there gung-ho, but he went about it entirely the wrong way. Acts chapter 7, beginning in verse 23, we have Stephen's sermon speaking of Moses, and he has this to say about Moses' intentions. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel, speaking of Moses. And seeing one of them being wrong, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptians. Notice verse 25 with me. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. And on the following day he appeared to them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, men and brothers, why do you wrong each other? But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? And at this retort Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian. Moses ran. Moses ran from the wrath of Pharaoh. Moses had to run because he took God's timing and tried to make it his timing. He tried to do things on his time schedule, but God had another plan. God said, wait. He spends another 40 years with his wife, father-in-law, and children, as we see in Exodus 2:16 through 22 in the land of Midian. God provides Moses with a new life from that Egyptian life as he gave up those things in Egypt. And in a way, God says, wait. After those 40 years and that new life, God finally says, it's time. And now that it's time, Moses is the reluctant hero, as he makes several excuses there at that burning bush to not take up the mantle as the deliverer of his people. Exodus 2:23-25, we can see that God was ready to deliver the people of Israel. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. They cried for rescue from slavery, came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and I love this last line, and God knew. Moses was ready to go 40 years ago, but not so much now. God's timing is not always our timing, but we see the need for this hero and for Israel. They are enslaved, they need rescuing, and who rescues better than a hero? Moses is called through that burning bush, and we have this dramatic kind of wrap up of his origin story. As he has been prepared for all this time, God has been preparing him while he trained in Egypt for 40 years. He prepared him while he served as a shepherd in the wilderness with his father-in-law Jethro for 40 more years. He taught him knowledge, then he taught him humility. And Moses was being prepared for the mission at hand. God is also preparing us as well. I used this passage Friday in my Friday devotional, and I want to use it with you now. Grace 2:8-10. Ephesians 2:8-10. Had Grace on the mind, which is very appropriate that Brother Terry led Amazing Grace a second ago. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no man may boast. And this is the part I really want us to pay attention to. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. God has been preparing the good works we are to walk in, and God has been preparing us, just as he prepared Moses for a long time. As we'll see as we go through this study, we too can be heroes. We too can be faithful to God. We too can stand tall in the kingdom. After the burning bush, Moses was sent out. After his origin story and this time from the burning bush, and finally accepting that he would be that deliverer, something had shifted in him. A fire was relit that had been there 40 years ago. The fire was lit by that burning bush that didn't burn up that bush. All powers and ability, however, that Moses has, they're granted by God, right? As we shift into what is Moses' superpower, or strongest superpower, because he had a few. The Bible tells us he was meek, and that's certainly a wonderful ability to have, to keep your power under control, to maintain your composure at times when it's hard, to deal with things in a proper way. He was also a great leader, but that's not quite his strongest superpower either. Surely you may say it's the working of miracles. He parted the Red Sea. He threw his staff down and became a snake. He pulled his hand out of his bosom and it was leprous. He stuck his hand back in his shirt and it wasn't leprous anymore. And many other mighty wonders did he do through the hand of God. Surely that was his greatest superpower. I don't think so. Hebrews 11 lets us know that his greatest superpower was actually his faith in God. Turn with me to Hebrews 11. We'll start in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Moses' superpower, and a power that we can have as well, is faith. That trust in God that He will deliver us from whatever situation we find ourselves in, so long as we are obedient to Him. That trust and faith that God exists and that He rewards those who seek Him. But Moses also, unfortunately, had a weakness. He had his kryptonite. His kryptonite, even though he could keep himself meek, even though he could often keep himself and his power under control, his kryptonite was frustration with the people of Israel. We know that they rebelled time and time again, and on many occasions Moses got mad and Moses reacted. He first reacted by slaying that Egyptian when he saw him beating his fellow servant. We saw that he got aggravated and mad and fueled with rage as he came off that mountain and he threw down the tablets of God, breaking them. And rightfully he was justified in being upset with them. He even made them drink ground up gold that he put into the water. He was properly mad. Those two seem basically justified. But in Numbers 20, we see the situation where his actions were not justified. Many times in this story about striking the rock to bring out water, we think of his disobedience and striking the rock instead of speaking to the rock to bring forth water. But Moses' real mistake was getting frustrated at the people and not giving the glory to God, but instead taking the glory for himself. Numbers 20, beginning in verse 2. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, Would ye that we perish when our brothers perish before the Lord? Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness, that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vine or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them, and give the drink to the congregation and to their cattle. And Moses took the staff before the Lord, as he commanded him. So it's God doing this, right? It's God doing this through the hands of Moses. But again, any power that Moses has comes from God. Any blessings, any positive attributes that we have come from God. Verse 10. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. Notice again, verse 10. Hear now, you rebels, speaking, he says, shall we bring you out water from this rock? Speaking, I'm assuming, of Moses and Aaron. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly to the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. They made a mistake. Both of them did. But Moses really got frustrated and let the moment get away from him. And in that moment, not only because of his disobedience to speak to the rock instead of striking it, but his arrogance in saying, We brought you forth water. His frustration cost him the promised land. His kryptonite was his frustration with the people. Righteous anger is okay, but you must be angry and sin not. Now, what about us? What is our kryptonite? What is our sin that we struggle with? For each one of us, it's going to be something different. Each person has a different kryptonite. And as we'll see through the studies, sometimes that kryptonite is not always our sin or our wrongdoing, but what others have done to us and how we react to that, or what others may potentially do to change the route. Sin destroys lives, sin destroys marriages, and most importantly, sin destroys precious souls. We must separate ourselves from the things that lead to sin and try to get as far away from that kryptonite as we can. What does Superman do when he's around a piece of kryptonite? He tries to what? Get away. He tries to separate himself as far as he can from that source of weakness, or you might say in our case, that source of temptation or trial. Try to separate yourself. As we talked about, sometimes it takes drastic measures to cut that sin and the source of that sin out of your life. When we thought of the idea of figuratively cutting off a hand or plucking out of an eye. Superheroes have to make choices. Moses, through faith, made some very wise choices, as we saw there in Hebrews 11. He gave up the riches of Egypt for the treasures of Christ. Now I ask today that you make the right choice, that you give your life to God in all that you do. Let God take hold of the figurative will of the Batmobile. Let Him take hold of your life and lead you where you need to be. Now we may have some here this morning who have not yet given their life to Christ. And if that's the case, the waters are ready. We would love nothing more than to baptize you into Jesus so that you may start that walk as a superhero. But if you're here this morning and you're already a Christian, but those trials and temptations, that kryptonite for you, whatever it may be, has got you under your skin and it has brought you down to your knees. God is ready to forgive you. We are ready to forgive you. Whatever your need, please come as we stand and we sing.